They bought a burned-down mansion for almost nothing. Everyone thought they were out of their minds. But what they found inside those charred walls changed everything and revealed a secret no one saw coming. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The road that led to the property wound through fields that had long since forgotten cultivation. Grass grew high and wild, brushing against the sides of the car as O'Ivor and Claire Matthews drove toward the horizon, where a line of trees hid the house they had come to see. The sky above was pale and dry, the color of old parchment, and the air smelled faintly of smoke even before the first glimpse of the mansion appeared. It was the kind of smell that clung to history, a scent that seemed to have soaked into the soil itself. The narrow gravel path jolted beneath the tires, and with every bump, a small cloud of dust rose behind them, erasing the road they had already traveled. Inside the car, there was a silence that felt heavier than anticipation. They had spoken endlessly about this place for weeks, about its price, its size, its promise. But now that it stood waiting somewhere ahead, neither of them could find the right words. Oliver's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, his expression focused and unreadable. Beside him, Claire sat with her camera resting on her lap, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the leather strap, as if the weight of it gave her courage. When the gates finally appeared, rusted and leaning, she drew in her breath. They were beautiful in their own way. Iron twisted into a pattern of vines and roses, their shapes blackened and stiff from fire and years of neglect. The padlock that hung between them was red with corrosion. Oliver stepped out, his boots crunching on gravel, and pulled at the chains until they rattled loose, forcing just enough space for the car to pass through. Claire watched him from her seat, feeling both admiration and unease. The sight of him against the massive gates, one man moving what time itself had sealed, seemed to symbolize everything about what they were doing. As the car crept forward, the landscape changed around them. The overgrown driveway was lined with skeletal trees that bowed inward as though in solemn greeting. The grass was waist-high, filled with burrs and wildflowers that had no right to bloom there. And then, rising from the hill like the ghost of an age that refused to end, the house appeared. It was larger than she expected, even in ruin. Columns of scorched stone framed the entrance, and black vines climbed toward the broken roof. The windows were empty hollows, their glass long since shattered, yet even in their emptiness they seemed to stare outward, reflecting nothing. For a long time neither of them spoke. Claire lifted her camera and pressed the shutter. The sound echoed strangely, swallowed by the still air. On the small screen, the house appeared almost alive. Light leaking through the cracks in the roof, like veins of gold across the darkness. Inside, the smell of ash was stronger, heavier, mixed with damp earth and decay. The wooden floor beneath them groaned softly as they stepped through the door. It was like walking into a body that had once been alive. Every wall bore the memory of fire-scorched plaster, melted paint, and streaks of soot climbing toward the ceiling. Yet there were also hints of grace that refused to vanish. A strip of floral wallpaper that had survived untouched. A curved banister carved from oak that still held its shape. A chandelier whose crystals had blackened but not fallen. Oliver's eyes moved carefully across the space, calculating what could be restored, what could be saved. Claire moved slower, drawn not to structure, but to feeling. She photographed the shapes of destruction, the play of light against ruin. Each image felt like a confession. There was a kind of stillness in the house that was not quite silence. It was layered, like breath beneath the surface of things. Claire noticed it first, while focusing her lens on a crack in the wall. The faintest movement of air brushed her wrist, though no window was open. She looked up and for a moment had the strange impression that something within the house had turned its attention toward her. It was an irrational thought, fleeting but distinct. She stepped back, lowering the camera, and exhaled. The echo of her own breath returned to her, almost delayed, as if the house had sighed in answer. Oliver was in another room, examining the beams, speaking to himself in the quiet, methodical rhythm of someone imagining possibilities. His voice reached her through the corridors like a distant current of reassurance. He believed that anything could be rebuilt. It was that belief that had made her fall in love with him, the way he looked at broken things and saw beginnings instead of endings. But here, surrounded by charred walls, even his optimism felt fragile. Claire took another photograph, and in the faint reflection of her lens, she thought she saw a figure near the doorway, a soft blur of light shaped like a woman's shoulder, then gone when she blinked. She laughed nervously and told herself it was only dust, the kind that dances where sunlight meets shadow. By the time they reached the upper floor, evening light had begun to slide through the holes in the roof, painting long, slanted patterns across the ruined hall. The rooms were skeletal. Some ceilings had collapsed entirely. Others hung low and dangerous, held by nails and willpower. In what must once have been a bedroom, Claire found a fragment of lace curtain caught on a nail. It was brittle to the touch, but still white beneath the soot. She folded it gently, unsure why, and slipped it into her pocket. The gesture felt almost like a promise. That night, they camped inside what had once been the dining room, spreading a blanket on the driest part of the floor. Through the gaping window frames, they could see the moon hanging low and bright over the land, its light silver against the black outline of the house. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain about to fall, though the sky was clear. Oliver studied blueprints by the light of a lantern, his shadow flickering across the walls. Claire lay back, looking at the ceiling beams and the stains of smoke above them. The rhythm of his pen scratching paper was steady, comforting, and yet beneath it, she thought she heard something else. A faint ticking, like the sound of an old clock hidden behind the walls. There were no clocks here. When she mentioned it, Oliver only smiled without looking up. He said it was probably the wood contracting as it cooled. She nodded, though she did not believe it. In the morning, they walked the grounds, mapping where the gardens might once have been. Behind the house stood the remnants of a fountain, cracked in two, filled with weeds and rainwater. A small bird drank from it, and then darted away as they approached. Beyond the fountain stretched an orchard of dead trees, their branches twisted skyward, black and leafless, as though still reaching for something lost in the fire. Claire took pictures until her fingers ached, each click of the camera shutter sounding louder in the stillness. When she reviewed the photographs later, she noticed that in one of them, taken near the fountain, a faint pattern of light appeared against the base of the house, almost like the imprint of a hand. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to delete it or keep it. Days passed in a rhythm of work and discovery. Oliver scraped soot from the stone walls and spoke of new floors, new wiring, new life. Claire cleaned surfaces, sorted debris, documented progress for her blog. The followers who saw her photographs commented that even in ruin, the house looked alive, as though it were trying to breathe again. She wanted to believe that. But each night when the lanterns were out and the silence returned, the house seemed to shift around them. Floorboards creaked where no one walked. A door would drift open despite being wedged. Sometimes, just before sleep, Claire felt a faint vibration through the floor, like the heartbeat of something massive lying beneath them. One afternoon, as they explored a back corridor half collapsed from the fire, Claire noticed a peculiar patch on the wall. The soot there was darker, thicker, almost oily, and the shape of it resembled the outline of a palm pressed flat against the plaster. The sight unsettled her more than it should have. She raised her camera, hesitated, and then lowered it again. There was a difference between recording beauty and intruding on pain, and this, she felt, was the latter. She told Oliver about it that evening, but he dismissed it gently. He had spent the day measuring the stability of beams and calculating costs. To him, every mark was evidence, not omen. He kissed her forehead and told her she was seeing poetry where there was only structure. But poetry, Claire thought later as she lay awake, was exactly what this house was made of. Burnt, fragmented poetry, written in the language of wood and smoke. When the rain came, it came suddenly. Wind swept through the broken windows, scattering dust like ash. They ran from room to room, placing buckets under leaks, laughing at first, until the laughter gave way to frustration. Water dripped steadily through the ceiling into the hall, forming small pools that reflected the fire scars on the walls. That night, after the storm, Claire stepped into the hall barefoot and stood in the middle of those reflections. The air was cool and wet. The house was utterly still, and yet she felt watched again, not by something hostile, but by something waiting. She whispered softly into the air, a simple question: "What do you want from us?" But her own voice echoed back, distorted, as though the house had repeated the words in a tone she didn't recognize. The next morning, they found the old library. It was a room unlike the others, its shelves still standing, though blackened by soot, and beneath the ash-covered floor, a pattern of mosaic tiles shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Claire brushed at them with her sleeve until the colors re-emerged: blue, gold, green, a forgotten sky beneath their feet. It was in that room that she first felt a warmth, not of sunlight, but of presence. It seemed to gather in the corners, pulsing gently, a reminder that the house, despite all its ruin, was not empty. By the end of the week, exhaustion settled over them like dust. Oliver's optimism faltered under the weight of endless tasks. He spoke less, worked more. Claire photographed less, thought more. Yet beneath their silence, something held them there, something neither of them could name. It was not pride or stubbornness alone, but an invisible thread pulling them deeper into the house's history. One evening, as twilight fell, and the last light of the sun turned the soot on the walls to gold, Claire noticed something glinting in the corner near the staircase. She knelt and brushed aside debris. There, half buried in ashes, lay a small metallic object. When she lifted it, she realized it was a music box, its surface blackened, its winding key missing. She turned it over in her hands, and without warning, a faint melody began to play, slow and uneven, the notes trembling as though drawn from memory. Oliver, hearing it from another room, came running, but by the time he arrived, the music had stopped. The air, however, was still vibrating with the echo of those fragile notes. They stood together in silence. Through the open window, the last light faded, leaving the house in shadow. Claire looked up the staircase, where darkness thickened between the broken rails, and she thought she saw movement. Nothing clear, only a suggestion of someone stepping back into the deeper dark. She blinked, and it was gone. Oliver took the music box from her gently, turning it in his hands, but it remained still. That night, the melody returned in her dreams, woven into the sound of wind and rain, rising from somewhere deep within the house. When she woke, she thought for a moment she heard it still playing, faint and persistent, as though the house itself was trying to speak through it. She lay there listening, unable to tell if the sound came from the walls or from within her own heart, and for the first time she realized that perhaps there was no difference at all. The house had begun to breathe, and they, unknowingly, had already started to breathe with it. Morning broke gray and reluctant over the hills. A pale mist clung to the ground like a second skin, softening the shape of the land and blurring the edges of the half-restored mansion. Claire woke before Oliver and sat for a while in the hollow quiet, her eyes tracing the fractured ceiling beams above their temporary bed. The faint scent of ash still lingered in the air, though she had grown almost used to it. It was the smell of persistence, of something that refused to fade. When Oliver stirred beside her, she turned toward him, searching for the same brightness she had seen in his face the day they first arrived. But the light was dimmer now. Fatigue had carved shadows beneath his eyes, and when he rose, his movements were slow and deliberate, the motions of a man who had already begun to bear too much weight. They ate in silence. The bread was stale, the coffee thin. Rain had fallen during the night, leaking through the roof and leaving small, dark patches on the floorboards. Oliver wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and muttered something about fixing the beams before winter came. Claire nodded but said nothing. She was watching the light as it slid across the ruined wall, catching on the edge of a cracked mirror that leaned against it. For a moment, she thought she saw her own reflection move out of rhythm with her body, a brief, impossible flicker of someone turning away just as she looked closer. She blinked, and the mirror showed only her tired face, her camera resting on the table behind her like an unused eye. As days passed, the house seemed to feed on their exhaustion. Every task revealed another failure beneath it. A wall that appeared stable crumbled when touched. Pipes that looked intact split open with the first use of water. Oliver worked longer hours, his body bent beneath labor that never ended. The soft hum of his optimism, once so constant, began to falter. He grew quieter, more practical, his speech reduced to measurements and lists. Claire watched him lose himself in the rhythm of repair, as if he believed that enough work could silence the unease that hung in every room. She tried to help, but her own strength came in bursts. The house weighed on her differently. It didn't challenge her muscles, it challenged her sense of peace. When she looked through her camera, the lens captured not the progress they were making, but something else, something that seemed to live beneath the surfaces. In her photographs, beams bent like bones, light pooled in corners where it should not have reached, and faint shapes appeared in reflections. Once, while developing a picture taken in the library, she saw the outline of two small figures standing near the window, faint as breath on glass. The next morning, when she went to take the same picture again, the light in that corner was cold and dead, and the air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the house resented her attempt to look too closely. Oliver did not want to hear about it. He loved her, but he was tired of ghosts that had no proof. When she tried to show him the photographs, he glanced at them politely and then returned to his tools. The gulf between them grew silently, like a crack spreading through stone. Sometimes, when they lay side by side at night, she would feel his breath steady and slow beside her, and realize he was no longer dreaming of what the house could become, but only of the work left to do. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, Claire went into the library alone. The smell there was different. Dry, dusty, untouched. She noticed for the first time that one of the tall shelves was misaligned, leaning slightly away from the wall. When she pressed her hand to it, she felt a faint current of air, impossibly cool against her palm. Her curiosity stirred. She pushed gently, and the shelf shifted with a sound like a sigh. Behind it, a narrow crack revealed itself, a seam in the wall where plaster had been broken and clumsily repaired long ago. She ran her fingers along it, the dust coating her skin in a fine gray film. The air that escaped from the gap smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric, untouched by the dampness that filled the rest of the house. She called for Oliver, her voice echoing strangely through the halls. When he arrived, sweat-streaked and weary, she pointed toward the shelf. He hesitated for a moment, then set down his hammer and helped her move it aside. The shelf groaned as if protesting, but eventually slid far enough for them to see what lay behind. The plaster had crumbled away, revealing wooden boards that looked cleaner than the rest of the wall. Oliver knelt, pressing his ear against the surface, and heard something, an emptiness, a hollow space where solid wall should have been. Without speaking, he fetched a crowbar. The sound of splintering wood filled the library, sharp and startling, as the boards gave way. Dust rose in a golden cloud, swirling through the narrow beam of sunlight that filtered from the broken window. Behind the boards was a small chamber, no larger than a closet. It was dry, untouched by fire or time. Inside stood a child's narrow bed with an iron frame, its sheets yellowed but intact. A doll with a cracked porcelain face lay on the pillow, one eye missing. On a small table beside it sat a music box, identical to the one they had found weeks before, though this one gleamed faintly as if it had been waiting. And on the desk, covered in dust but protected by a pane of glass, rested a leather-bound book. Claire reached for it with trembling hands. The first page bore a name written in graceful script, Elizabeth Rowan. The handwriting was delicate, looping, filled with the certainty of someone who once believed her life would last forever. The early pages spoke of gardens and laughter, of sunlight falling through the very windows now blackened by soot. But as Claire read on, the tone darkened. The writer described the nights when the house began to whisper, when doors opened without wind, and her children complained of voices that came from beneath the floor. The final entries were fragmented short sentences filled with fear and guilt. One line caught Claire's breath. If anyone hears the house cry, don't leave it alone. It only fears being forgotten. Oliver leaned over her shoulder, reading silently. His expression, usually calm, flickered between disbelief and something deeper recognition, perhaps, or empathy. He closed the book carefully, his fingers tracing the edge of the leather. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The house seemed to listen. Somewhere above them, a loose shutter creaked against the wind, but the air inside the chamber remained perfectly still. That night, they sat by the faint glow of a lantern, the diary open between them. The words of Elizabeth Rowan clung to them like smoke. Claire imagined the woman writing in this same house as it burned, trying to hold on to what she loved. Oliver stared at the pages and felt an unfamiliar humility. For the first time, he saw the house not as a challenge to conquer, but as a living thing burdened by memory. The following days felt lighter, though they worked harder than ever. The house seemed to cooperate in small, uncanny ways. The rain that had tormented them for weeks ceased. The air grew drier, warmer. The smell of soot began to fade, replaced by the faint scent of wood and sunlight. When Oliver hammered nails into new beams, the sound no longer echoed hollowly, but carried a steady rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Claire photographed everything, the new boards, the patches of fresh plaster, the way light curved gently through the dust. In one photograph, she noticed that the sunlight formed a perfect circle on the wall where the hidden room had been sealed for decades. She printed it and pinned it above their bed. The diary became their guide. Oliver began restoring the library as Elizabeth had described it in her entries, preserving the old beams instead of replacing them. Claire cleaned the tiles in the mosaic floor until the colors returned, deep blue and gold, like fragments of sky scattered beneath their feet. The more they worked, the more the house seemed to breathe with them, At night, the wind hummed softly through the halls instead of howling. The wooden beams no longer groaned in protest, but creaked gently, like the settling of a body into sleep. One evening, Claire found the music box again on the table in the hidden room. Its key was still missing, yet when she brushed the dust from its surface, it began to play. The melody was slow and tender, each note trembling, as if uncertain of itself. She sat on the floor and listened, the sound wrapping around her like a whisper. Oliver appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't question the impossibility of it. He simply sat beside her until the final note faded. For the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. But peace is never a permanent state. It only visits. A storm arrived without warning 3 nights later, rolling over the hills with thunder that shook the windows. Oliver had gone into town to buy supplies and was delayed by the flooded road. Claire was alone when the first drop of water struck her hand, as she stood beneath the leaking ceiling. She gathered buckets and towels, trying to protect the fragile progress they had made. The wind pressed hard against the walls, making the house groan and shudder. Somewhere above, a shutter tore free and banged repeatedly against the frame. She climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The air was thick with dust and rain. Water poured through a gap in the roof, dripping in rhythmic beats onto the wooden floor. As she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight caught something extraordinary. The water that ran down the beams glowed faintly, tracing lines of light that pulsed with a strange energy. They connected like veins, forming shapes that moved and changed. For a moment, she saw them gather into the faint outline of a woman's face, gentle, sorrowful, watching her. It lasted only a second before the light faded, leaving the wood wet and dark again. Claire stood there, heart pounding, yet no fear touched her. The house wasn't warning her, it was speaking. The message was simple. It was alive, it remembered, and it wanted to be understood. She lowered the flashlight and closed her eyes, listening to the rain until it softened into a calm, steady rhythm. When Oliver returned at dawn, the storm had passed. He found her sitting near the staircase, exhausted but serene, her camera beside her. The first light of morning streamed through the holes in the roof, casting gold across the wet floor. She told him quietly that the house had shown her something beautiful. He didn't ask what. He only helped her to her feet, and together they stood in the light that filled the broken house, feeling for the first time that they were no longer fighting against it, but moving with it. The day unfolded gently. The air was clean, the ground outside glistening from the rain. As they walked through the rooms, checking for damage, they found that very little had been harmed. The leaks had spared the library. The diary, the bed, the hidden room, all remained untouched. Claire photographed the attic again later that morning, capturing the traces of the rain's path down the beams. On the developed film, faint streaks of light still shimmered, forming curves that resembled handwriting. She studied them for a long time and then smiled. The house, she thought, had written its own confession across its bones. By evening, when the sun dipped low over the hills and turned the scorched columns of the house to gold, Claire and Oliver sat together outside for the first time in weeks. The house loomed behind them, dark, yet somehow radiant, a shape of survival against the sky. They said little. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but full like breath held in awe. Inside those walls, a century of pain had found a new rhythm, and the house, once broken and still, now kept its own quiet pulse, breathing again through them. The storm had washed the world clean. When dawn rose over the hills, the air carried the scent of wet earth and pine, sharp and new. Light filtered through the broken windows, spreading in golden bands across the floorboards. The house no longer seemed wounded. It was quiet, yes, but not in the old way. The silence now was full of breath, like the pause between a heartbeat and another. Claire awoke to that silence and felt its difference instantly. She lay still, listening, her hand resting against the wooden floor. It was warm beneath her fingers. Not from sunlight, not from the fire they had lit the night before, but from something softer, a quiet warmth that rose from within the house itself, as though the structure was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Oliver stirred beside her. His face, once lined by exhaustion, had softened. There was a calm about him that she hadn't seen since they first arrived. When he rose, he looked around the room and smiled faintly. Not because it was finished. It wasn't. But because it was alive. He crossed to the window and pushed it open. The hinges, long rusted, moved easily this time. Cool air flowed inside, carrying the smell of rain-soaked grass. The light fell on his shoulders, and for the first time, Claire noticed how naturally he seemed to belong to this place. She thought of Elizabeth Rowan's words in her diary, of someone giving the house a new heart, and realized that perhaps this was what they had done without meaning to. They worked through the morning, cleaning the last traces of the storm. The library was untouched, its shelves still standing proudly around the hidden chamber. The diary remained safe on the table. When Claire opened it again, the ink looked darker, more vivid, as if the storm's moisture had woken the words. She ran her fingertips across the page and read the last line aloud under her breath. If anyone hears the house cry, do not leave it alone. She looked around the room, at the restored floor tiles, at the faint beam of sunlight striking the music box, and she knew the house no longer cried. It breathed. In the weeks that followed, their days settled into a rhythm so natural it felt rehearsed. Oliver's strength returned, his confidence quiet and steady, now instead of urgent. He repaired the last broken windows and rebuilt the garden wall with his own hands, stone by stone. Claire painted the frames white and hung simple linen curtains that swayed gently in the wind. They planted young trees along the drive, not to replace what had burned, but to promise that something would grow again. Each evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, they sat on the steps of the porch and watched the colors fade across the fields. The house stood behind them, patient and tall, its shadow stretching across the grass, like a hand resting lightly on the land it guarded. It was during one of these evenings that they made a discovery. While repairing the lower wall near the foundation, Oliver's chisel struck metal. At first he thought it was debris, a forgotten nail or hinge, but when he brushed away the dirt, he found a small, cylindrical container, sealed and darkened by age. He brought it inside, calling for Claire. Together they pried it open with careful fingers. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a folded letter, its paper yellowed but miraculously preserved. The writing was the same graceful hand as in the diary, Elizabeth Rowan. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Claire read them aloud slowly, her voice trembling at first, then steadier as she went on. To whoever finds this, I leave my home not in despair, but in hope. The fire took more than I could bear, but it did not take the soul of this place. I believe that one day, someone will hear its breath again. If you have found this letter, it means you have. Keep it safe. Let the walls remember kindness. A house does not die when it burns. It dies when it is forgotten. May you live here not as owners, but as those who listen. By the time she finished, her eyes were wet. Oliver reached for her hand, and for a moment they both stood silent, the weight of time folding around them. The room seemed to hum softly, as if acknowledging their understanding. He placed the letter back into its case and set it on the mantel above the fireplace, where the light of dusk caught its edges and turned them gold. They didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing to say. The letter had said it all. From that day on, they began to treat the house not as a project, but as a companion. Oliver stopped trying to erase every imperfection. He left the faint scorch marks on the banister and the patch of uneven brickwork near the kitchen door, calling them its memories. Claire filled the rooms with photographs, each one a record of light returning. Her camera no longer captured shadows that shouldn't exist, or figures that hovered in the periphery. Instead, the images glowed with warmth, with ordinary sunlight. One photograph in particular, taken in the library, caught her attention. It was the same angle as a shot from months before. The mosaic floor, the doorway, the faint reflection in the glass cabinet. But now everything was transformed. The shadows were gone, replaced by a soft, golden radiance. She printed the two pictures side by side and hung them above the fireplace, marking the passage between what the house had been and what it had become. As spring deepened, they began to open the doors to visitors. Artists, travelers, friends from the city came to see what they had done. Some stayed for days, helping in the garden or painting in the sunlight-filled rooms. Claire called it an artist's retreat, though it felt more like a sanctuary. People arrived weary and left lighter. They said the air in the house felt different, that it carried a stillness that made them remember how to breathe slowly. No one mentioned ghosts, though sometimes at night, when music drifted from the living room or laughter rose from the porch, Claire thought she could feel another kind of presence among them, quiet, approving, at peace. The hidden room remained untouched. They kept it as it was, a small shrine to the life that had come before. The music box sat on the table, and every few weeks, without anyone winding it, the faintest melody would rise from it at dusk. It was always the same, tune slow, careful, impossibly tender. Oliver called it coincidence. Claire knew better, though she never argued. Some things did not need explaining. They only needed to be heard. As months passed, the house continued to change in subtle ways. The ivy that had once strangled the outer walls now bloomed with green leaves. The air inside no longer smelled of soot, but of wood, flowers, and old paper. The creaks in the floor sounded less like complaints and more like the murmurs of contentment. Sometimes, when Claire walked through the halls at dawn, she would pause and place her hand on the wall, feeling a faint pulse beneath the plaster. It was steady and slow, like the rhythm of sleep. One afternoon, as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase on the library table, she looked toward the window and caught her reflection in the glass. For a heartbeat, she saw not herself, but another woman standing there, a gentle face framed by dark hair, eyes filled with calm recognition. Claire did not startle. She only smiled, understanding that what she saw was not a ghost, but memory made visible, a moment of acknowledgement between the living and the remembered. When she blinked, the reflection was gone, replaced by her own image. Yet the air felt warmer, filled with quiet gratitude. That evening, the sun set in a blaze of gold behind the hills. The house glowed in its light, each window catching fire without flame. Oliver lit candles in the main hall, and the small flickers mingled with the fading daylight until the whole place shimmered. Claire brought out her camera, but hesitated before pressing the shutter. Some scenes, she thought, were not meant to be captured. They were meant to be lived. She set the camera down and went to stand beside him. Together, they watched the day's last light fade from the walls, replaced by the softer glow of their candles. Later, as night settled and the fields outside darkened, they sat by the hearth. The fire crackled, its reflection dancing across the letter framed above the mantel. Claire leaned against Oliver, her head resting on his shoulder. The warmth of the flames mingled with the warmth that radiated from the walls around them. She thought of the day they had arrived, of the ash and ruin, the sound of the first door opening, the fear and wonder in her chest. It felt like another lifetime. The house had been silent then, waiting. Now it whispered constantly in small, comforting sounds, the sigh of wind through curtains, the faint creak of settling beams, the soft pulse of firelight on stone. Oliver reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "It's finished," he said quietly, not meaning the work, but the journey. She nodded. Outside, the rain that had started softly against the windows stopped. In the calm that followed, the house seemed to exhale once more, a deep, slow breath that filled the room. The next morning, the world was washed with light. Mist drifted low across the orchard, where new leaves glistened from the rain. Claire stepped onto the porch barefoot, the boards cool beneath her feet. She looked out over the land, at the line of young trees they had planted months before. The air was sweet and clean. Behind her, she heard Oliver moving through the house, his footsteps steady and unhurried. A bird called from the roof. For the first time in her life, she felt no division between herself and the place where she stood. She belonged to it as much as it belonged to her. When she turned back toward the doorway, she paused. Through the open windows, she could see the library, the sunlight spilling across the mosaic floor, and the faint outline of the music box on the table. A glimmer of light flashed briefly from its surface, like a blink, and then was gone. She smiled. The house stood quiet now, but not still. It watched over them, breathing softly, its long vigil ended. The years of silence, of ash and memory, had folded into something new, a living rhythm shared by wood, stone, and the two souls who had come to listen. Claire stepped inside, the morning light following her, filling every corner. And as the door closed gently behind her, it sounded not like the shutting of a home, but the heartbeat of one that had finally, after a century of waiting, come back to life. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you. There are so many more to discover. And if this story touched you, share it with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.